The Hundred Years' War presents a statistical anomaly, outnumbered English infantry repeatedly annihilating superior French heavy cavalry. Yet viewing Agincourt or Crécy as miraculous upsets ignores tactical reality. These were not accidents, but the output of a specific, repeatable industrial system. We must analyze the English system not just as the longbow, but as a combined arms doctrine integrating terrain, dismounted men-at-arms, and missile fire to invert the era's shock cavalry meta, providing a mechanic-level breakdown of how this kill box was constructed, how it functioned, and why it eventually failed. To understand the English system, we must first accept the strategic paradox defining the conflict. England was a demographic dwarf attempting to coerce a continental giant, necessitating an offensive war on foreign soil while lacking the manpower for a symmetrical attrition fight. This asymmetry forced English commanders to adopt a doctrine of tactical defensiveness to achieve strategic goals, essentially baiting the enemy into attacking a prepared position where superior numbers became a liability. The first component of this machine was the archer corps, but we must immediately discard the popular image of the levied peasant. These were semi-professional light infantry operating warbows with draw weights exceeding 100 pounds, a physical requirement so demanding that archaeological evidence from the era reveals skeletal deformation in professional archers, effectively treating the human body as industrial machinery. This biological artillery was useless without protection, leading to the second component, the dismounted man-at-arms. By ordering the gentry to fight on foot, English commanders removed the horse, the primary vulnerability to missile fire, and transformed their heavy infantry into a static anvil designed solely to stiffen the line and prevent the formation from crumbling under shock. This created a combined arms interdependence where the archer provided the friction to disrupt the enemy, while the dismounted knight provided the cohesion to survive the response. The third component was the field fortification, specifically the rapid deployment of sharpened stakes or chevaux de frise, which functioned as portable terrain modifiers that could artificially constrict the battlefield and negate the kinetic advantage of cavalry. Opposing this system was the French heavy cavalry doctrine, a model built on shock, honor, and momentum that had dominated European warfare for centuries, precisely because, in an open field, against standard infantry, it worked. The French charge was not a foolish mistake. It was the meta of the day, designed to shatter formation morale through sheer mass and velocity. The English system was explicitly designed to exploit this predictability, turning the French preference for decisive engagement into a mechanism for their own destruction. However, the lethality of this kill box was entirely dependent on logistics, specifically the arrow economy. A single engagement required the delivery of hundreds of thousands of arrows, meaning the system was not just a tactical formation, but a logistical pipeline that had to sustain a terrifying rate of fire, ensuring that once the trap was sprung, the volume of missiles would be sufficient to maintain area denial until the enemy's cohesion disintegrated.
The deployment phase relied on the hearse or harrow formation, though we must pause here to acknowledge that primary sources and modern reconstructions vary significantly on whether this was a true triangular wedge or simply forward-projecting wings. Regardless of the exact geometric layout, the intent was to create a crossfire kill zone rather than a simple frontal wall. This geometry was useless without the correct terrain selection, which served as the absolute prerequisite for the English system to function. The flanks had to be secured by geography, dense woods, marshland, or rivers, to force a frontal engagement. This utilization of terrain went beyond simple defense. It was an act of compression, narrowing the effective battlefield to deny the enemy their numerical advantage and channeling their mass into the pre-sighted lanes of the archers. Yet a defensive formation is worthless if the enemy refuses to attack, necessitating a provocation loop to trigger the engagement. Since the English doctrine was immobile and relied entirely on reactive fire, commanders had to goad the French into initiating the kinetic phase through strategic raiding, insults, or feigned vulnerability.
The tension of this standoff was critical, as the English could not advance without abandoning their stakes and protective terrain, meaning the entire battle hinged on the psychological necessity of forcing the French nobility to choose honor and aggression over patience, thereby convincing the enemy to voluntarily enter the prepared funnel where their superior numbers would work against them.
The engagement typically commenced when the French vanguard crossed the threshold of effective range, a distance distinct from maximum flight range, where the kinetic energy of the warbow was sufficient to inflict damage not just effectively, but catastrophically. The initial volleys were rarely intended to wipe out the enemy instantly. Rather, they established a beaten zone, a terrifying area denial grid that forced the advancing cavalry to crowd inward to avoid the flanking fire, inadvertently assisting the English compression tactics. As the range closed, the physics of the arrow versus armor engagement became the decisive variable, though we must address the persistent plate penetration debate with nuance. While a heavy bodkin point could technically breach plate under ideal test conditions, the battlefield reality was that the English archers primarily targeted the horses, which remained largely unarmored on their flanks and heads. A wounded horse does not simply stop, it rears, panics, and collapses, creating an immediate cascade failure within the tight formation that shattered the momentum of the charge before it ever made contact. This generated a deadly traffic jam effect, where fallen mounts and thrown riders became artificial terrain obstacles, forcing the following ranks to slow to a crawl or trample their own comrades, effectively stripping the cavalry of its shock value and reducing them to stationary targets. When the disorganized remnants of the French line finally collided with the English men-at-arms, the kinetic advantage had evaporated, turning the battle into a grinding, static shoving match where the English defensive anvil held firm. It was in this chaotic stall that the English system demonstrated its true combined arms brilliance. Once their ammunition was exhausted or the enemy was halted, the archers dropped their bows and transitioned instantly from missile troops to light infantry. Armed with mallets, heavy daggers, and swords, these unencumbered men swarmed the flanks of the exhausted, armor-heavy French knights, exploiting their superior mobility to target the gaps in plate armor, visors, groins, and armpits, turning the technological advantage of the French aristocracy into a liability. This slaughter was amplified by the mud factor, often overlooked as ambient flavor, but actually a critical mechanic. Heavily churned soil, such as the clay of Agincourt, degraded rapidly under thousands of hooves, transforming the killing ground into a viscous trap where a knight in full plate, once knocked prone, could drown in inches of slurry, or simply die of heat exhaustion and asphyxiation, physically unable to rise against the suction of the terrain.
The immediate output of these engagements was a casualty ratio so disproportionate that it often triggers skepticism in modern observers, yet the primary sources remain consistent in describing lopsided exchanges where English losses were counted in the dozens or hundreds against French losses in the thousands. This disparity disrupted the fundamental economic engine of medieval warfare, the ransom system, where capturing nobility was typically preferred to killing them. At Agincourt, this logic collapsed entirely when Henry V, fearing a rally by the uncommitted French rearguard, ordered the execution of prisoners, proving that the tactical integrity of the kill box took precedence over the financial norms of the era. To understand why the French nobility, a warrior caste raised from birth for combat, repeatedly fed themselves into this machine, we must look beyond stupidity and identify the paralysis of institutional inertia. The French command structure was a feudal aggregation of rival peers rather than a centralized military hierarchy, meaning that coordination was often impossible against an English force where the king or his lieutenants held absolute professional authority. For a French noble, refusing to lead the vanguard was a stain on personal honor, a cultural exploit the English ruthlessly leveraged to ensure the enemy would attack regardless of the tactical suitability. However, the English system was far from invincible, and we must examine the specific conditions where it failed, most notably at the Battle of Patay, which serves as the definitive counterexample to the Agincourt model. In this engagement, the French finally broke the provocation loop by catching the English army in transit before the archers could deploy their stakes or establish their defensive frontage, revealing the system's fatal reliance on static preparation. When forced to fight an encounter battle in the open without the benefit of prepared terrain, the archers were ridden down exactly as conventional wisdom dictated they should be.
This proves that the doctrine was a time-dependent mechanism. It required a setup phase that, if interrupted by aggressive scouting or rapid cavalry movement, left the infantry lethally exposed. Furthermore, we must exercise caution regarding the technological mythology surrounding the longbow, specifically the armor-piercing narrative often attached to the bodkin point. Modern metallurgy and ballistics testing suggest that high-quality Milanese plate was often impervious to direct arrow strikes, implying that the system's success relied less on punching through breastplates and more on the sheer volume of fire degrading the formation's cohesion and targeting the less protected limbs or the mounts. Finally, we cannot ignore the friction multiplier of weather. In almost every major success of the English system, wet ground played a significant role, suggesting that while the doctrine was sound, its historical dominance was partly a product of environmental conditions that maximized the penalty for heavy armor maneuvering on soft soil.
The eventual obsolescence of the English system arrived not through a failure of the bow itself, but through the Valois reforms and the introduction of effective field artillery, specifically the Bureau brothers' mobile cannons, which fundamentally broke the static defensive meta. At engagements like Castillon, French artillery finally outranged the longbowmen, forcing the English to abandon their carefully chosen terrain and attack to silence the guns, thereby inverting the tactical dynamic and compelling them to fight as clumsy aggressors against a prepared French defense. This shift marked the end of the longbow's supremacy and accelerated the transition from warrior aristocracies to the era of professional mass infantry, where the bow was eventually replaced by the arquebus, not because early firearms offered superior stopping power, often they were significantly weaker, but because a competent musketeer could be drilled in weeks, whereas a warbow archer represented a strategic investment requiring a lifetime of physical conditioning. Ultimately, the English system was a fragile time versus space equation that functioned only as long as the enemy agreed to fight within the prepared kill zone. The history of these battles proves that while superior combined arms tactics can brilliantly mitigate numerical inferiority for a century, they cannot indefinitely compensate for a strategic refusal to adapt once the technological context of warfare shifts, leaving even the most perfect doctrine one innovation away from total irrelevance.